Those of you who are already logged in, are you guys able to see my blue slide deck screen that says Accelerate Webinar? You can just raise your hand in the just raise your hand with the tool and let me know if you can see. Okay, great. Thank you very much. We'll get started here in about 4 minutes. For those who are just joining us now, we'll be getting started at 2 p.m. Eastern Time in about a minute or so. Okay, it is 2 p.m. I just want to welcome everybody here to our webinar today, being hosted by Accelebrate. We're going to talk about some of the new things that are in Angular 5. As part of that, we'll also do some live coding here and explore a few of those things during the webinar. My name is Eric Greene, and you can see my name there on the slide, as well as my email address. Make sure you write that down and feel free to reach out to me via email once the webinar is over. As we go throughout the presentation here, we're going to start off with a slide deck, and then we're going to transition into writing code. While we're doing this, if you have questions, go ahead and place your questions in the questions box, which is part of the webinar software. When we get to the end of the webinar, and I get to the end of my coding presentation, I'm going to kind of go through and try to answer as many questions as I can. And if I don't get to your question, just feel free to send me a follow-up email afterwards, and I'll do my best to get back to you. So anyways, let's go ahead and get started here with our content. Before we dive into the actual Angular 5 content, I want to say a few brief words here about Accelebrate. Accelebrate is one of the best training companies out there in the marketplace. I've been doing business with them for years, and I can tell you what a great organization they are to work with, and I know that they have a lot of satisfied clients out there who purchase their training services. The big thing that makes Accelebrate different from a lot of other training companies is that we do a lot of customization. So we can do in-person private training, we can do in-person with some remotes, we can also do online training as well. And we do a lot of recording in these classes so students can walk away with a recording of the class and then be able to make use of it for the online classes. Our instructors are experts. We go out and find the best talent in the industry, people who have real-world experience and have the ability to communicate that experience, and then send them out to your organization to help you and your team become better at whatever technology or skill set you've hired us to come in and do training about. We are very much into customizing. While we definitely have lots of courses and lots of standard outlines, we're always eager to customize those outlines for our customers to make sure they're getting the exact technology set that they need. Take Angular, for example. You want an Angular class? We'll come teach you Angular. You want Angular from a test-driven emphasis? We'll do Angular from a test-driven emphasis. You want to use Angular with Redux using NGRX? We'll add that to the outline as well and come in and teach your team how to use that. We do our best to rapidly respond as quickly as possible to any types of problems or questions or emails that arise before class, during class, and after class. And we truly have some of the best logistics, period, in terms of delivering content, in terms of actually delivering workbooks and making sure that training facilities are ready to go. We definitely excel at that. Here are some related courses that we have to Angular. We have Introduction to Angular 5, Advanced Angular 5, Comprehensive Angular 5, which is really a combination of the Introduction and Advanced into like a 5-day class. We have Angular 5 from a test-driven emphasis if you're big into testing in your organization. We can also do a whole full stack. So for example, let's say you want to train your development team on a Java backend full stack or a .NET backend full stack. We can do that with Angular 5. We could also do the same thing with Node.js if you're using Express on the backend. And then we can incorporate other technologies like Redux and such. So we definitely we cover a lot of areas, and we have a lot of great instructors that'd be more than happy to help you with your training needs. So I just wanted to throw that out there to you real quick before we actually dive into the content of the webinar. If you're looking for training services, reach out to Accelebrate. I am sure you'll be pleased with your experience and with the course that you receive. So here's what our agenda is going to be for the webinar. We're going to kind of do a high-level overview of all of the new little features and stuff that were added in Angular 5. Then we're going to do some code demonstrations, and then like I said, we'll take some questions here at the end. Okay, so the first question is, I'm sure we're going to have some folks attending the webinar who have never used Angular before. So it's not just what's new with Angular 5, it's, the whole thing is new. What is Angular? Angular is basically a programming framework that's used to build desktop and mobile user interfaces. The languages that are being used are HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Instead of using JavaScript directly, we actually do our coding in TypeScript, but the TypeScript content actually gets transpiled to JavaScript. So ultimately, it is a JavaScript-based framework. Some of the highlights: you can develop across all platforms. Our emphasis in this webinar is going to be inside of a web browser like a standard web page, but you can use this to build native apps on mobile devices. You could combine this with Electron and build desktop apps. It truly is a UI framework that you can use everywhere. Speed and performance. This is actually a big one. One of the big things that Angular has been working on with Angular version 4 last spring and now Angular 5 is really increasing the speed and performance. Back in Angular 4, it was all about ahead-of-time compilation. In Angular 5, it's about compiler optimizations and stuff like that. And we'll talk about some of those as we go through. Incredible tooling. There's lots of great tooling out there that you can use with Angular 5. Probably the best tooling, and it's not even an Angular 5 specific thing, but the best editor out there, in my opinion, is Visual Studio Code. And I love Visual Studio Code and its TypeScript support. So if you're using TypeScript and you're building Angular applications, you've got some great tooling there to help you out. And of course, it's loved by millions. Angular JS, the original version of Angular, and then now Angular 2 and later, is used by millions of folks all over the world to build the front end, to build the UIs for their web applications and other apps. It's definitely a very, very, very popular framework. So when you jump into the Angular ecosystem, you're not jumping into something that only a few people are using and is going to get tossed to the side at some point in the future. You're jumping into an ecosystem that's trusted by enterprises all over the world and backed by one of the biggest technology companies in the world, Google. And they definitely put a lot of effort into continuing to enhance it and improve it and expand it and make it even better. And it's already awesome, but they make it more awesome with each release that comes out. Speaking of releases, for those of you who are new to this, we'll kind of give you a quick little release history, if you want to call it that. Angular JS is the original version 1 UI framework that had the Angular name. It was created back in prehistoric times. It's actually very old. I think Angular JS originally came out in like 2009. A lot has changed since 2009. And back in 2014, that was when we first started hearing about Angular 2. And then in September of 2016 or thereabouts, Angular 2 was officially released. It had been in beta months before. In fact, we were teaching classes on it while it was still in beta. But it was actually officially released, and people started using it officially for their applications. And it took off. It's just kept on growing. It was popular when it came out, and then it just took off from there. Angular 2 represented a bunch of enhancements and improvements to the overall ideas and principles that even go into building UIs. So as you can imagine, from 2009 to 2016, especially in the programming world, a whole lot changes. And so that's what we saw happen with the release of Angular 2. Then about 6 months later, we had the release of Angular 4. You might be wondering where Angular 3 was in the mix. Well, it turns out during the development of Angular 2, the router library for Angular 2 actually got a major version number of version 3. And so they had a problem. The whole framework was version 2, but the router was version 3. And so, when they decided to start doing major releases every 6 months, they decided just to jump from Angular 2 to Angular 4. And around March of this year, Angular 4 was released. Now, Angular 4 was not some major rewrite of Angular 2 like Angular 2 was of Angular JS. Instead, Angular 4 just had a lot of enhancements and improvements and speed, performance improvements and stuff like that. And that came out in the spring of this year. And then in the fall of this year, Angular 5 was slated to come out. And Angular 5 came out right at the end of October, beginning of November. And the big thing in Angular 5 is lots of performance improvements and then some other enhancements in various areas, which we're going to take a look at here. Now, Angular 6 is slated to come out in the spring of 2018. Angular 6, just like Angular 5 and Angular 4, should once again just be a matter of a simple upgrade process to upgrade. But you never know what's going to be in store for the next versions when they come out. But the point is, Angular is under a lot of rapid, fast development, improvements, and enhancements. And if you're looking for a framework or library to jump to use for building your next generation applications, you want to use something that's getting a lot of enhancements and improvements. you don't want to get into something that no one's updating or using anymore. So there's a ton of activity surrounding Angular, and it really is a great framework to build your UI applications with. So let's talk about some of the new things that have come out here. Now, if you're totally brand new to Angular, some of these new things may make sense, some of them may not, but for those of you who've been using it for a little while now, you'll probably recognize some of the advantages of these new features. And then what we're going to do is dive into some code and actually kind of go through and explore those features and kind of see how they work. And as a quick reminder for those who have been joining us here after we got started, as we're going through this presentation and then the code demonstrations and you have questions, please be sure to fill out the question box that's part of the GoToWebinar software. And then when we get to the end of the presentation, I'll do my best to answer people's questions. Okay, so the first thing we have going on in the new Angular has to do actually with the CLI, and it has to do with something called the Build Optimizer. So what's the purpose of the Build Optimizer? It's actually going to do two big things for us that we're going to care about in terms of Angular 5. It's going to improve something called tree shaking. What is tree shaking? In the JavaScript in the JavaScript world, one of the problems that developed over the course of time was that a lot of code was included in JavaScript applications, but it was code that was never executed. It was just part of a library, and maybe one or two functions of that library were actually used, but the remaining functions weren't. And so you had a bunch of dead code, and the problem is not only was it in the project and really just not being used, but the code itself was actually getting downloaded to web browsers and taking up memory space inside of web browsers, and so people recognized this as a real problem. And so with ES 2015 modules, the concept of tree shaking came into the JavaScript world. And the idea was that if we had a way of doing static analysis of what is otherwise dynamic code to identify the parts of the JavaScript libraries that aren't being used, we could then potentially drop them out of the final build. I say final build in quotes. Drop them out of the final build, the final bundle that gets downloaded, thereby making the download size smaller, making it faster, eating up less bandwidth, and of course eating up less memory in the web browser that was pulling it down. Towards that end, or really to that end, Angular seeks to improve upon that ES 2015 tree shaking process with their build optimizer, by which they can actually mark code as pure, thereby making it something that could be dropped out if it wasn't being used. Another cool thing the Build Optimizer does is it actually removes decorators from the final output. One of the features that exists in TypeScript is something called a decorator. Decorators are used by the TypeScript compiler to basically set up different things, different attributes and stuff about our classes. Well, that actual decorator content is only really needed by the TypeScript TypeScript compiler. It's not really needed at runtime. So the Build Optimizer has been updated to actually remove this decorator code from the final output. So basically the idea behind this Build Optimizer is you're going to end up with a smaller bundle that's produced, which means less code being downloaded to the web browser. There's really nothing you have to do to make use of this. This is just an internal improvement to Angular. Like I said before, one of the big things the Angular team keeps doing is actually going in and improving the internal processes so that you can actually just have a better overall framework for running your application. Another thing they've done has to do with Angular Universal. So what exactly is Angular Universal? Roughly speaking, Angular Universal is the ability to run your code in the client or to run your code on the server. Well, when you do server rendering and stuff like that and you download the actual server rendered content, the problem is you still have to make a second HTTP request back to the server to get the data to populate that content. Well, what they've done is they've started setting up inside of Angular 5 the ability to transfer that state data as part of the actual UI that's being sent down, which then means you don't have to make a second HTTP request. Now, this only benefits you if you're actually doing Angular universal programming. If you're just doing, standard web application development where you're just, you're downloading all the JavaScript files to the browser and then just running all your code there, this doesn't really help you that much. Another thing that was added with the Angular universal stuff is enhanced support for the DOM. So one of the things that sometimes needs to be done is DOM manipulation. Well, the problem is on the server, you don't really have a DOM like you do in a web browser. So Angular 5 incorporates something called Domino, which basically gives you a server-side DOM structure that you can use to do server-side DOM manipulations, allowing you to push more processing up to the server away from the client. There were also some additional compiler improvements. The Angular compiler is now a TypeScript transform. You can also configure the preservation of whitespace. Previously, whitespace was always preserved. Now you can turn that off. And then there's also improved decorator support. So now you can do runtime calculations within your decorator configurations. This is a big one here. The number, date, and currency pipes, as I'm sure everybody knows, has internationalization and localization and stuff that's applied to those. So for example, if I'm in the United States, I get one type of currency format or one type of date format, and if I happen to be in Canada, for example, with the date formatting, the month and the date are switched. Well, these pipes can do all of this formatting for us. The original version of these pipes basically used the built-in web browser internationalization API. The problem is all of the web browsers out there don't support the exact same API for this internationalization API, so you actually have to include a bunch of polyfills in the web browsers. Now, polyfills are great for lots of things. They can give you basically standards-based environment, that you can then write your code against. But what the Angular team decided to do is actually to create their own custom internationalization library, and as a part of that, produce an API that's really more consistent with what developers expect for working with these pipes. And our little coding demonstration will actually take a look at this, and we'll do it with the currency pipe, and I'll show you how to use the new one, what happens if you use the new one the old way, and then how to actually include some code so that you can make use of the old one for legacy type code that you might have. Another thing they've done is just replace the reflective injector with a static injector, and this eliminates another polyfill. This is another one of these internal things. There's nothing you really need to do. It's handled for you automatically, especially if you're using the CLI. And by the way, if you're doing Angular development, I didn't always used to be a CLI fan. I used to enjoy the process of putting together my development environment and configuring everything the way I wanted it. But the CLI over this past year has experienced so many improvements that I love using the CLI. In fact, now when I teach my Angular classes, instead of using my own customized project, we actually do use the CLI now. It's a really nice tool. We'll be using it here shortly when we start doing our little code demonstration. Another thing they've done is incorporated some zone speed improvements. Well, the question is, what's a zone? Zones are something that were added as part of Angular 2, and it has to do with triggering the change detection mechanism. Anybody here who's from the older days of Angular JS, and you incorporated a third-party component into your Angular application, you probably remember having to call like $apply or $digest whenever some type of asynchronous operation executed with that third-party component. And the reason you had to do that was Angular had no way of knowing the underlying data changed, and so because it didn't know the data changed, it didn't know to update the UI, so you had to trigger that. In fact, when you use things in like Angular JS like ng-click, the reason you use ng-click instead of the regular on-click is that the ng-click is actually set up to trigger the UI update process through $apply when you click the button. Well, in Angular 2, they switched from this very explicit mechanism that was built into all the individual directives and other things like that in the web page, and they switched to a new system called zones. What do zones do? Zones basically wrap every single asynchronous mechanism in the web browser so that no matter what triggers the asynchronous mechanism, Angular can be notified to update the UI. So literally, that's why in newer versions of Angular, if you include some type of third-party thing and do an asynchronous operation, you don't really have to tell it to run digest or apply because they don't exist anymore, but you don't need to because of this whole zone system. Well, the problem with the zone system, though, is that if you're making a lot of changes, it can kind of trigger the UI to refresh itself a whole lot. And it can be a little bit inefficient. So it's great for the most part, but sometimes it can cause some problems. So Angular 5 now gives us the ability to actually turn off the zone system. And then what happens is we have to manually trigger the change detection process, which then, of course, updates the UI. But this can be really helpful if you have an application that's having some performance issues because of the number of times that change detection is being triggered overall. Okay? Another thing that's been done is that multiple names can now be used for export as. So this is useful with various libraries and stuff you might be working with when you're migrating from maybe one version that uses one set of names to a newer version that uses a second set of names. You can actually support both the old and the new names at the same time. Another cool thing is the upgrade to RxJS 5.5 as well as the HTTP client. Now, technically, the HTTP client was actually released with Angular 4.3. But in Angular 5, it has, instead of being one way of doing your HTTP requests, it's really become the way to do the HTTP requests. Now, in my working with Angular 5, I'm not getting a deprecation notice if I use the older HTTP service. At one point back when I was working with HTTP client, initially back this past summer, the original thought process was that you would get a deprecation notice in Angular 5 saying the HTTP service has been deprecated, use the client instead. In my working with Angular 5, I haven't seen that deprecation notice pop up. Nevertheless, HTTP client is now the new way of actually making requests to REST services and stuff. One of the nice things about it is that it actually has a little bit simpler API. It takes care of that whole res JSON thing for you, so you don't have to do that. Also, it's got better strong typing through the use of generics. We'll actually use it here in our demo application that we're going to build here shortly. RxJS, of course, has been upgraded to 5.5. The biggest thing with this in terms of Angular 5 is there's an improved syntax for importing RxJS. One of the things that's always bothered me since Angular 2 was that when I wanted to work with RxJS, I had to always go to the top and do these extra little import statements to pull in the map function or what have you. And the problem is that it wasn't like a regular import where I'm doing a named import or even a default import. It was just like importing a file. And it was just kind of this thing that kind of broke what I felt was the nice continuity of syntax throughout my page. Well, they've fixed this. So what we're going to use now is a pipe function, and then we're going to pass into it actual calls to things like map, and then we'll import map using a named import. So it's a little bit cleaner syntax, in my opinion, for working with RxJS. There's a new and improved CLI version 1.5. In fact, we'll be using 1.5.5 in class today. Now, the new CLI was not really released as part of the Angular 5 release. The CLI project kind of runs on a different version numbering scheme. But with version 1.5, it does now use Angular 5 by default. One of the things that they had hoped to do in the new CLI was actually to have ahead-of-time compilation turned on as the default. Basically, when you're running your Angular stuff, you can run it in two modes. You can run it in JIT mode, which stands for just-in-time compilation, or JIT, or AOT, or ahead-of-time compilation. Just-in-time compilation basically accomplishes 4 of the 5 steps of compilation on the actual client side in the web browser. Of course, as you could imagine, that can be a little inefficient because you're doing a lot of processing in the client web browser, and this processing has to occur in every single client web browser. Whereas with AOT, instead of doing four steps in the client, you do 4 steps on the server and then only 1 step on the client. Of course, doing 4 steps on the server means you can do the 4 steps at development time when you produce your final bundle, and then they're only done once, and then the client has a lot less work. Well, AOT is great for production, but not the best for development. Why? Because every single time you change your files, you have to reprocess the AOT stuff while you're doing development, and that just takes more time. In fact, when I first started working with the AOT stuff back in the springtime, I noticed that when I ran the just-in-time stuff, it was great for development, it was super fast, but when I turned it to AOT, while it produced a great production build, it was not something that I was going to sit there and wait for every single time I changed a file. Well, their goal was to actually make AOT by default, but if you actually go and search on GitHub, you'll find a big issue about this where people were basically running into a lot of problems where it was still taking too long to compile. So the Angular team is still committed to getting AOT to work. Their goal is to get it to be able to compile ahead of time very large, complex applications in 2 seconds or less. And their thought process is if this can be done in 2 seconds or less, this will be acceptable for development purposes, which then allows you to test with AOT in development. I will say this, testing AOT in development would actually be helpful. I have had situations in the past where the just-in-time stuff worked great, but then when I tried to compile it out to AOT, I ran into all types of problems. A lot of those problems can be avoided by using the CLI, but if you're using your own homegrown Angular project, you can definitely run into issues when trying to switch from just-in-time to AOT. So being able to develop in the same type of configuration setting that you're using in production is probably a good idea anyways. So hopefully they'll be able to achieve that. When you go through and actually read the history of all the speed improvements they've been able to do in Angular, it really is amazing all the things they've been able to do to really make it faster. So I have no doubt they're going to be able to pull this off and make AOT the default approach. Next thing we're going to take a look at is talk a little bit about the Angular forms. They added the update on setting. This was available back in Angular JS, but was oddly missing from Angular 2 and later until Angular 5. And it basically has to do with when do we actually update the form model and when do we run the validators. Angular 2 and later basically did it on blur. Well, one of the things they had added back in Angular JS was an option called ngModel options, where you could actually configure this to be some other event other than blur. Reason being is that every time you go to leave a form field, it would rerun all of this code, and maybe you don't want to do that. So in Angular 5 here, they've actually added this back in, and we're going to take a look at it using reactive forms, but it works great with both template and reactive forms, and it controls really the execution of validators when you leave a form field, or in the case of setting it to submitting the form, and then of course updating the form control objects. And then the last thing, we're not going to spend really any time on this, is some new lifecycle events were added for the router, so you can check those out. So here are some resources you can take a look at. This is the actual link to the blog post, which has additional details beyond the ones that I've shared with you. In fact, if I switch over to my web browser here, you'll see here's the actual blog post, and it goes through, and you can take a look at a high level of all of the improvements that were made to Angular 5. There we go. Also, another great resource is this Angular update guide. We're going to go ahead and actually look at this before we do our code, our coding for our little demonstration application. But hopping over to here, the Angular update guide, you can actually specify what version you're on and what version you want to upgrade to. And then it'll actually tell you what you need to do to make that happen. So for example, let's say I'm on 2.4 and I want to go to 5. And you can, I guess complex is kind of like beauty. It's in the eye of the beholder. You can be the best judge of whether or not your application is basic, medium, or advanced, but we'll say advanced there. And then you can say, show me how to update. It'll actually walk you through all of the steps for the things you want to take a look at for doing an update. This is really outstanding. I have not had the opportunity yet or the need to go through and actually complete one of these checklists. But as a person who does a lot of front-end web development and a lot of front-end training, and I get questions all the time about what am I going to do when the latest thing comes out, this is a phenomenal tool. This is a great tool. I really haven't seen anything like this for any other UI framework or library out there. I'm not saying there isn't one. If you know of one and you want to put it in the question window so I can check it out after the webinar, I would love to do that. All right, but as you can see here, it's really, really amazing what they've put together here. So when we talk about, selecting a framework for your enterprise applications, this right here is the kind of stuff that people are looking for. We're looking for the latest and greatest, but we're also looking for a way to upgrade our stuff as time goes along so we can stay up to speed on the latest and greatest things that are happening. Because as we all know, there's nothing worse than getting really super behind on your library or framework and then having to do some big, massive update at the last minute. Or not the last minute, but some massive upgrade after a lot of different changes, and then really struggling through that. So, okay, so there we go. So there's the upgrade guide and the blog post, which you can check out. So what I want to do is I want to walk through some examples here. We've already looked at the upgrade guide, so we're not going to do the thing at the end. We just did that just now. But we're going to step through the first 5 here, and we're going to use the CLI. I've already created a sample project for us, so we don't have to do anything with that. But we are going to go through and use the CLI to build some parts and pieces, and we're going to explore these 4 new features: the HTTP client with RxJS, internationalization of pipes, turning off the zones, and the Angular forms. And so we're going to build a little application. My intent is we're going to do this up until a little bit after 1 o'clock or I guess, 3 o'clock Eastern time, and then we'll start taking some questions. But we'll go ahead and get started on this now. So to get access to the code, by the way, is going to be pushed up to the webinar. So I'm going to show you that slide now because I know I'm going to get questions on will we be able to get access to this code? And the answer to the question is yes, there's a GitHub repo. And once I'm done coding all of this live for you, we'll go ahead and push that up to the repo, and then you can grab that after the webinar is over. Okay, so jumping back over to here, I have an editor set up with basically a brand new Angular CLI project. Literally all I've done is create the project and let it download the packages. And we're going to walk through a series of steps to build a simple application. Some of the things we're going to look at are going to be new features in Angular 5. Some of the things will just be doing Angular development. For those of you who are really brand new to Angular, hopefully you'll find that beneficial in giving you kind of a better idea of the development experience that one might expect when doing Angular development. You'll notice I'm using an editor here called Visual Studio Code. If you go to code.visualstudio.com, this is the editor here. It's actually totally cross-platform. It runs on Windows, Mac, and Linux. As you can see here, I'm on a Mac. And it is by far the best general-purpose text editor I have ever used. I use it for JavaScript development, TypeScript development. I use it to write SQL code. Use it for Python code. It's a fantastic editor. It's open source. It's built on GitHub's Electron platform. You definitely want to check out this editor if you're not using it already. And the reason why I actually switched to it was because of the excellent TypeScript support for doing Angular development, which is why I'm really promoting it here for you now. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started building ourselves a little application. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to set up a new module. So let me expand this out a little bit. And I am going to zoom in, make that a little easier for you to see. When you use the CLI, you can basically run a bunch of commands from the command prompt to basically create different project assets. For example, I want to create a module called CarTool. So I'm going to say ng g, and g is short for generate, module car-tool. When I hit enter, this is actually going to create for me under the source folder an actual CarTool folder with a CarTool module that's been pre-populated with code. That's why I say if you're going to run with Angular, use the CLI. It's a great tool, not just for getting started, but for building real applications. So once we do that, the next thing we want to do is we want to create our first component. We'll use the CLI to do this. We're going to say ng space g. Then we'll type out the word component because we're going to create a component. A component is nothing more than just like a UI widget. It's a combination of a template and then binds to data that gets displayed on the screen. So ng g component, and we'll say car-tool. We're going to specify the path to our module and then to a components folder. And then we'll say car-home. Then we need to specify the module that we want to register it with. We've only created one module so far. So we'll say -m car-tool. So we have ng generate component car-tool components car-home -m car-tool. Go ahead and run that. Underneath components, you'll see it'll create a bunch of files for us. We're going to have a CSS, HTML, a unit test file, and then the actual TypeScript file for the component. Always double check, by the way, your CLI commands before you type them. Code generators are great, but if you type the wrong thing, you can get a lot of code that you didn't want generated, and then you have to go back and clean it up, which can be a real pain. So always double check your commands before you actually run them. Now, the next thing we're going to want to do is we're going to want to import this new module that we've created into the application module that was originally created when the application itself was created with the CLI. So to do this, we're going to come into here and we're going to say import car-tool module from, and then we'll say /car-tool. Take a look at this IntelliSense. This is incredible. So -car-tool, car-tool module, boom. Now we're going to take this car-tool module that we've imported and we're actually going to list it down here after our browser module like that. So we'll go ahead and save that. All right. Now, the next thing we're going to want to do is, in order to display our new car home component that we've created, we're going to want to export it from the car-tool module. So we're going to come over here to car-tool module and we're going to say exports, and then we can say car home component, and that will actually export that for us so that it will be available for us to use in templates such as the one that's going to be inside of app-component.html. So here's app component. So I'm going to basically blow away all of this content and we're just going to replace it with a reference here to car-home. There we go. Whenever you create a component, it's always going to be a custom element. We're going to have this car-home as our actual element tag. You always need to have a closing tag, by the way. You can't do this as a self-closing. The Angular compiler will complain about that. Now you'll notice in my editor, I have this little green squiggly. And the reason I have that is I have a bunch of extensions over here that help make my editing experience much better. One of those things that I have installed is something called HTML hint. And HTML hint is basically telling me that in an HTML file, I need my doc type declared first. Of course, this is a template file for a component. We're not going to have a doc type. So what I need to do is I need to add a special file to my project that basically configures my hinter to work the way I want it to for an Angular project. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come up to here and I'm going to create a new file. It's going to be called .html hint rc. There we go. And then I've got a configuration. I'm going to spare you the pain of watching me type a configuration. We're actually just going to paste that right in there. And there's my configuration. If you want to set up your own configuration, just Google for HTML hint, and you'll find the website, and it's got a nice little UI for creating the configuration file for this. So once I save it and give this thing a second to update, you'll see that now the green squiggly is gone. But for the other things that I am checking with the linter or the hinter, I can make sure that I'm writing good code. Okay, next thing we're going to do is head back over to our component, and we are going to, at that component, the component in car tool for car home, we're going to come into here, and you're going to see that we have app-car home. If you like to have a prefix on your components, you can. As you notice over here in mine, I did not put a prefix. So I'm going to remove the prefix from here. When I do this, though, I'm going to get a red squiggly. And that's because the Angular CLI is configured to enforce a prefix. Now, like I said, this is up to you. This is just my personal preference here. But one of the things we can do is the CLI gives us a configuration file where we can actually configure various things about our project. One of those things we can configure is this prefix. So I'm going to remove it from here. I also need to remove it from one other place. One of the cool things about working with TypeScript is there's something called tslint. tslint is a linter that verifies your TypeScript code is written the way it's supposed to according to whatever the settings are. If you come over to here, you're going to see that I have tslint installed here as an extension inside of my editor. So this is the tslint JSON file that has the configuration. Well, down here in our linter, we have it configured to basically enforce that my directive selector and component selector have a prefix on it. So I'm going to get rid of app so I don't have to have my prefix. Now, like I said, this is totally up to you if you want to do this, or if you want to keep the app prefix, you're of course more than welcome to. The key is do whatever your style guide is for your team. But this shows you how you can customize these files the CLI creates for you. So we'll go ahead and close that, and you'll notice now the little red squiggly here has gone away. Okay, so with that done, in our component HTML, you'll see it says car home now works. So what we're going to do is let's go ahead and run our project here, make sure I didn't make any typos or errors, and then if I didn't, we're going to continue on to the next part where we're going to dive into some Angular 5 stuff. So we're going to say npm start, and this is going to fire up my application. You can see there's this entire build process going on. This is a big part of that whole build optimizer and compiler things that have been improved, and you can see our Webpack process here has completed successfully. If you don't use the CLI, you have to set up all of this configuration yourself. Using the CLI, it works for you out of the box. So now, let's hop over to our web browser. And in our web browser here, we're going to go to localhost 4200, and we should get car home works. There we go. One thing I recommend is when you're doing front-end development like this in a web browser, always keep your development tools open. It's entirely possible I could have made a typo in my typing, and I probably will before the end of the webinar. Having your console open is a great way to see error messages that pop up, so then you can then respond to them. Also, sometimes it's possible your code looks like it's working, but there's actually errors or other warnings that are causing a problem behind the scenes. Having your console open is a great way to see those instead of mistakenly thinking your application is working fine as is. Okay, so now that we've got that, let's go ahead and jump into our next part, which is we're going to display a table of cars. And we're actually going to pull this table of cars from a REST service. So what I want to do is I want to show you how easy it is to incorporate a REST service into this application. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to come back to our terminal here. We'll stop the CLI. I'm going to type clear to kind of clear out all the mess. And we are going to install something called the JSON server, and then we're going to install something called concurrently. The JSON server is a JSON file-based REST service, and concurrently will allow us to run the JSON server concurrently with our Angular CLI web server. So we're going to say npm install -d, which means this is a development dependency, -e, which is the exact version, and then we're going to say JSON server and concurrently. So we'll go ahead and install that. While that's installing, we need to create a file over here called dbjson. So I'm going to create a new file called dbjson. And I have some JSON content that I'm going to paste over here. It's really just 2 records so that we have some data for our cars REST service. There we go. There's our cars data. Go ahead and save that. So now that we've got those installed, we need to make a slight change to our package JSON file here to configure it to go ahead and start both the Angular CLI web server as well as the JSON server. To do that, we are going to simply use these two commands right here. We're going to replace the built-in start, which simply runs ngserve, with a new start that's going to run ngserve and our REST task. And our REST task is configured here, running a JSON server on port 3050, referencing db.json as our actual file. What's cool is when we make changes to this REST service, it actually writes those changes to the db.json file. So we'll go ahead and save that. And just to show you this is working, we're going to go ahead and say npm start. And this will fire up our REST service as well as our web server. See, everything's running. And while that starts, let's switch back over to our web browser. In addition to getting our car home works, we can actually load up our REST service here and say localhost. This is running on port 3050. And we're going to look at the cars endpoint. And you'll see we get back our car data. So now we can incorporate the two of these together. One other thing, you'll notice that my web application and my REST service have a different origin. They're running on different ports. The JSON server is configured from the get-go to work with something called CORS, which allows something called cross-origin resource sharing, which allows our Angular application, even in our web browser, to be able to contact this other REST service and receive data from it. So it's very, very handy. So now we have a full database, in a sense, not a real database, but a database backend to our application. Literally that fast. No database configuration, nothing like that. We're up and running with a REST service. And all of it is, of course, managed through Node through the NPM package management system. So we'll go ahead and close these files up, and we'll go ahead and continue here. And we're going to build out a little bit of an application here to display a table of cars, and then we'll add some more functionality to it. The first thing we're going to do here is we are going to add a model to this. We're going to define it as an interface. So we're going to say ng generate interface, which is a TypeScript thing, car tool / models / car. And we'll go ahead and run that. And this is going to create for us a models folder underneath car tool with an interface here for our car. To save a little time, you don't have to watch me type out all the individual fields. We'll just pop that in there like that. The only thing I'll make mention to you of is the question mark means the ID field is optional, which would be useful if you were inserting a new car or something and you don't have an ID value yet. So there's our car model. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and build ourselves a little table that we can display our car data in. So we're going to open up our car home component.html, and I've got some table content here that I am just going to copy and paste. If this was a real classroom situation, we'd actually be coding this all together live, completely from scratch, but because of our limited amount of time, nobody needs to watch me type in THs and TDs. Here's our car home component. You can see we have a little thing here in case there is no data. And then, of course, here we're iterating over our cars and displaying our individual car fields for each row. So now that we have that, now we need to go ahead and set this up to be able to pull in the data from the REST service. Now what we're going to do is we're going to configure this to use the old HTTP client first, and then I'm going to show you what it looks like to convert it to the new HTTP client service. And we'll talk a little bit about that and then include some of that RxJS stuff along the way. So the first thing we're going to have to do is actually come over to car home component, and we'll need to import our model into here. So we'll say import car from ... / and then we have models. By the way, if you're ever having to go up multiple folders like that and you don't see the folder you're looking for, you probably have to go one more set of ... or maybe you went too far. But I found the IntelliSense on this is really good. When I'm teaching class and I'm kind of talking and not really paying attention to the number of dots that I'm putting, I've found that if I trust the editor in finding the file, it always works. If I decide, oh no, the editor must be wrong, let's run the code anyways, it doesn't work. So it does a really good job of helping you verify that you're referencing the right file. And especially in a large project, that can be really helpful. So this is going to pull the car interface into our component here. We need to set up a property on here to actually hold all of the cars. So we'll say cars, and we'll have a car array equal to an array just like that. Now, in order to make our REST service call, we're going to have to pull in the HTTP module. This is the old one. The new one is called the HTTP client module. But we're going to do the old one first, and then we'll run our code and then switch it. So in CarTool over here, we're going to come over to here, and I like to put a space between my stuff that I'm pulling in from Angular and the stuff that I've created. And this HTTP module comes from Angular, so the old one is called HTTP module, and we're going to import that from @Angular, /HTTP. There we go. And now we're going to take this module and we're going to import it into our CarTool module like this. So now we can make use of the HTTP services that it provides. Now, let's head back over to here, and let's go ahead and make use of this service so that we can make a request. So down here, we're going to need to actually inject it. So to do that, we first have to import it here, and we'll say @Angular HTTP. And now we're going to take our HTTP here. We'll come down to our constructor. We're going to say private HTTP : there we go. So this will inject the service and make it available on a private property called HTTP. And then down here, we're going to have some code to actually pull this in. So we'll say this.http.get, and then we're going to, back up to here, HTTP localhost, and we're going to get this off of 3050/cars. There we go. Now, after that, we're going to have our .map, and then we'll have res.json. That's going to convert our JSON to an actual JavaScript object. So JSON is a data format, a string, and res.json converts that string into an actual JavaScript object in memory. We're then going to subscribe to this. Subscribe. Not subscriber. IntelliSense is great until it's not. Okay, so subscribe, cars arrow, this.cars equal to cars. Now we're not quite done yet. You're going to see we have this red squiggly. This goes back to what I was talking about before with the older versions of RxJS. We had to write some import code that basically looked like this. Import. And then we're going to have RxJS/add operator/map. And that's going to pull in our map operator. Now you see the red squiggly goes away. Now what I didn't like about this was look at all of this here. We're pulling in our actual methods or objects that we're working on. It all looks good, and then we have this. Just simply pull in the map operator. I never liked that. Well, we're going to have some improved syntax for that here in a second. So now we've got our actual call here to the server to get our data. So let's go ahead and save that, and let's run our code and make sure everything works right. We'll go ahead and start. Give that a second to load up. And then we'll head back over to our web browser here, to demo app, and let's reload. There we go. We have our table, and we've got some data. Everything's working good. Now let's go ahead and upgrade this to work the way we should be coding it when working with Angular 5. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to head back over to our CarTool module, and we're going to change this, and we're going to say HTTP client module. And then inside of here, we're going to say core, all right, /HTTP, all right. Actually, not core, sorry, common. Thought something didn't look right. Common, there we go. So there's our client module. We're going to take this module and we're now going to import it here. All right, we can actually import both at the same time, which is why I kind of demoed both for you. It's not an all or nothing thing. You could actually utilize both in the same application, especially if you're working with legacy code, but you want to use the newer stuff. So now that we have that registered, come back over to our car home component here. And we're going to come to the top, and we're going to import the actual client like this. So we'll say import HTTP client, not module, client from at Angular, shoot, there we go, common / HTTP. So now we're going to be importing this new service that we can make use of. For our map operation here, we're no longer going to import it this way. Instead, we're going to import it like this. Import, and we're going to use a named import, so map from rxjs / operators. There we go. So now we've got our map being imported that way. Now down here, we're going to make a couple of changes here to our actual call to the service. We're going to make a copy of this. There we go. And we'll outdent that. But we're going to save the original one so you can go back and reference this later if you would like. So now for our GET request here, we're going to change this so that we can now use the new client service. And so we first need to inject it up here. And we're going to say private HTTP client : HTTP client, comma, there we go. And then we're going to come down here and we're going to modify this to say HTTP client instead of HTTP. As part of our GET request, we're going to use a generic and we're going to say car because we're going to be dealing with an array of cars. We'll have the same URL, but now with HTTP client, we can get rid of the .map. We no longer have to do the whole res JSON mechanism anymore. We can get rid of that. And so now we've got our cars being assigned to this. We'll go ahead and save that. You'll see everything compiled here successfully. You'll see our GET request actually occurred too. If we head over to our web page, you'll see everything loads up just fine once again. So you see how easy that was? We actually eliminated one step in our coding process, and we were able to more strongly type through the use of a generic type here with our call to GET. So now that we've got that, now we want to take a look at the enhancement to RxJS to be able to structure our piping mechanism, or to structure our operator functions a little bit nicer. We saw up here where we imported map from the RxJS operators. Let's go ahead and make use of this map down here in this code using the pipe function. So what I want to do is, if you go over to the web page, you'll notice all the colors start with a lowercase letter. I'm going to write just a little bit of simple code. You typically would do this with a pipe, but it's a good little demonstration of the new RxJS functionality. I'm going to come into here, I'm going to say .pipe, and then I'm going to say map. We're going to call that map function. Now with map, we're going to be passing in an arrow function here, and we're going to be getting our array of cars. And what we're going to do is we're going to say cars.map, and this is the actual array map. And we'll say car arrow, and then we're going to come into here, and we're going to say car.color equal to car.color.slice, and then we're going to say 0, 1, and then we're going to do .to uppercase, and then we'll simply do the rest of the word after that, so car.color.slice1. There we go. That'll do our uppercase for us in kind of a crude way. And then, of course, we're going to return back. We're going to return back our car. So we'll go ahead and save that there. So now, through the use of this pipe, we're calling this map function, and then now we'll ultimately get back our array of cars, but all the colors will be uppercased. So if I head over to here and reload, you'll now see we have blue and red with the first letter capitalized on both of them. Okay, so that's an example of the new RxJX map combined with the pipe mechanism and the ability to do a named import here. All right. Now, next thing we're going to do is we're going to take a look at how to add a pipe, the currency pipe, to our existing component to format the actual dollar amount here that we have for our price. So first of all, let's come into db.json and let's change that 123 to something like 15,000. We'll just save that. You'll see how when we save that, it automatically causes the REST service itself to update. And if we come back over here and reload, you'll see now we get our 15,000. But let's go ahead and add the currency pipe to this so we can see what that looks like in our output. So we're going to close a couple of files here. Go to car home. So here's car.price, and we are going to say currency. And what we're going to do is we're going to use the old syntax. So let's say we had an existing application and we were upgrading it to the latest version of Angular. We wanted to see what would happen if we tried to use the new pipe but use it the old way. So we'll say currency. We're going to format this as US dollars. We're then going to specify true, which means show the symbol. And then we're going to come in here and we'll just say 1.2-2 and format our number. So if we save that and come over to our web browser, you will see that it does in fact show the formatted price. And you might think, okay, cool. The old syntax works with the new pipe. But that is not the case. Down here you will see we have two warnings. This is why you want to have your console open. The UI may look correct, but the console will give you additional information letting you know what's not exactly correct. So how do we fix this in order to actually use the old version of the pipes, and then we'll go use the new version. If you wanted to be able to use the old version of the pipes, let's say you can't go through and update everything, what you can do is you can head over to car tool module, and here in the common module you can pull in the deprecated I18N pipes module, hit enter. If you take this and actually include this directly into here like this, now if you head over to the web browser, you will see the warnings go away because now you're using the old pipes. So it allows you to be backward compatible with the old. But let's say you did want to use the new pipes. What would the actual syntax look like? In this particular case, we're fortunate. It's very easy. All we have to do to be able to use the new syntax is simply replace true with the word symbol. And now we're using the new syntax. And if we come over to here, oh, hold on, you can come back here. I removed it from the import, but did not remove it from the actual imports down here. Let's save that. Reload, and now we get the new format using the new pipe, and we're getting no warning messages. So there you go. So there's an example of the new pipe that is available. This also applies to things like date and so on and so forth. Now, next thing I want to talk to you about is demonstrating the concept of no zones. This is kind of a thing that runs in the background, but it's kind of cool to actually see how this works. So I thought we'd take a minute or two to talk about it. Coming over here to our main file, the main file is kind of the top level file that bootstraps our application for us. A lot of folks don't know this, but you can actually pass in options to Bootstrap module. The new option that you can add is called ngZone, and we can say no op. And that's going to basically turn off ngZone. Okay? All right, so nothing's going to happen here when this runs. So this is interesting because now if we come over to here, you'll notice there's no data. Now if you come to network and you reload this, you're going to see a request to car was made. There's the data. The model was in fact updated, but because the actual zone mechanism was turned off, nothing triggered Angular to run change detection, which means the UI did not get updated. So how do we actually trigger change detection manually if we want to turn off zones? The way we're going to do that is we're going to come over to car home component, and up here at the top where we are importing our on init, we're going to say application ref, and we're going to inject the application ref service into here. So we'll say private ref. There we go. So now that we've injected that service, now what we need to do is actually reference this. In fact, we'll call it app instead of ref. We'll come down here, and in our subscribe function, once we have our car data loaded, we're going to actually add some curly braces to make this an actual function, actual code block. Now we're going to say this.app.tick. So zones basically call the tick function and trigger the UI to update itself. So we'll go ahead and save that. Head over to here. Now you see everything loads up for us. But we actually had to trigger that to run manually. Imagine doing that throughout your entire application. You would only really want to turn zones off if you had some type of really special use case where zones were causing real problems and you just needed a way to update things. It is possible when using zones to actually run things outside of a zone. That's existed in Angular since Angular 2. So if you just have a couple of things you want to do outside of a zone, you can do that now. But this completely turns off zones altogether, and this was added with Angular 5. So now what we're going to do is go ahead and turn the zones back on so we don't have to worry about dealing with no zones. We'll just comment that out and comment this out. We won't need that now. And then over here for main, I'm going to comment out the actual turning off of the zones. There we go. So let's save that and make sure everything runs properly before continuing on. Everything looks good there. Excellent. Okay, so our next step that we're going to do here is we are going to take a look at how to set up an actual form so that we could potentially add a car. I don't think we'll get to the part of adding a car, but that's actually okay because our focus here is really going to be on the actual update process, doing it on submit versus doing it on blur. So what we're going to do is the first thing is we are going to copy over a ton of HTML to our actual component. And I'll explain this here in a moment, but let me copy it first. So beneath this, we're actually going to put a bunch of HTML content. It's got some stuff in there we'll talk about in terms of the forms and the various event handlers and why I've hooked into them for the demo. So we'll go ahead and save that. We are going to make use of reactive forms. You can use template forms, but I'll be honest with you, I think reactive forms are a better way to go, and they are the default type of form that I use for all of the applications that I particularly work on. To add the reactive forms, we're going to come over here to our car tool. We need to import the module for that. One cool thing is if you actually type in from @Angular and then do your full-blown package that you want, if you start typing into here, you can actually get IntelliSense. So for example, I should be able to, actually Angular Forms, type in reactive forms module, pull that in, and we'll take this forms module and we'll include that here like that. There we go. Now that we have the forms module pulled in, now we can go ahead and start putting together our reactive forms over in our car form component. We'll go ahead and close that, and we'll close that as well. Okay, so here, right underneath our, or actually right up here, underneath our import HTTP client, we're going to say import, and we're going to pull in the form group, and we're going to pull in the form builder. There we go. And we're going to pull these in from our @Angular forms. There we go. So there's our form group and our form builder. We're also going to need a little validator function that we're going to use to demonstrate validations. We're not actually going to perform a validation, but we're going to be able to run the code so you can see when the validator itself would actually run. We're going to say const test validator equal to C. We'll also need to bring in our form control here up at the top. So there's form control. And we'll say form control. Great. And we'll have ourselves a little arrow. Now, with a validator, if you return null, it basically means the control was valid, so we're not actually making things invalid with this. But we are going to say console.log test validator. And this will actually let us know when the validator was actually called, because this is a big part of using the update on Blur and stuff like that. So now that we've got our test validator, now we need to come down here into our class and set up a couple of properties on it. We'll say public car form, and that's going to be of type form group. There we go. And then we're going to have another variable here called make update on, and we're going to default this to blur. We're going to switch it between blur and submit. This way we can capture it in a variable and then make use of that in our code. In order to use the form builder, we're going to have to inject that. So we'll say private form builder colon form builder. There you go, not boulder, but builder. Okay, now that we've got form builder, we need to set up our form. Because we are at like 11 after the hour, I'm just going to copy and paste this part, save a couple of minutes of setting up a form object. So we'll paste that in there just like that. So here, this is our car form object. You can see we have a make input, model, year, color, and price, which correspond to our table columns. Here, these are the default values, these empty strings. And you can see we're configuring that new update on feature. I'm basing the setting based upon whatever this is currently set to. And then here, you can see I have the validator being hooked in, like I have up here. The ability to hook in the validator is nothing new. That's been there for a long time. But the update on is brand new to Angular 5. One last thing we'll need to add to this down here is a little function that's going to say show car form. And this just allows us to actually output the current state of the car form object to the console so we can kind of see the interaction here. So this dot car form dot value, and that'll output the whole structure there. Okay, so we've got that. All right, so now we should be able to go ahead and run our form, and we'll head over to our web page here. Okay, and let's go to console, and we'll clear it out. Now we have this thing set up to blur, which is the default, which is the actual default setting for Angular is to do it on blur. Our update on here should actually be showing some information. Let's hop over to our form here real quick and see why it's not. This dot make update on. Did I not spell something correctly? Let's see. And I've got this dot make update on. That should be fine. Let me grab this spelling of it right here and come over to here. Paste that. All right. Okay, so back over to here. Well, not sure why that's not showing up. I'm not going to waste time there trying to figure that out. Let's keep rolling. So we've got our make, model, year, color, and price. So what we're going to do is, since we're doing this on blur, we're going to type in some text, and I'm going to blur out of the field. You'll see the second I typed in the text, it actually ran the validator, and then when I blurred out, it actually outputted the model here. If I were to do the add car on click, you'll see it outputs the model here like this. Okay? Also, if I do the on submit, it also outputs the model. So what we're going to do is we're going to switch this over to the submit approach. Here's my problem. I put a colon. It should be an equals. There we go. I knew something wasn't right. So let's change that to submit. And now with our submit, there we go. So now we're in submit mode. Now watch what happens when I type into the box. And I click out. You'll see I outputted the model, but you'll notice there's no A value in there. The reason why it outputted the model was over here I have it set up on blur to always output the model no matter what. But you'll notice there's no A value in there. If I type in more values and click out, there's still no update. Even if I click add car, there's no update. Why? Because I'm only hooked into the actual on click event. I'm never submitting the form. If I submit the form now, watch what happens. When I submit it, the validator ran, and the model now updated. So with the blur, which is what we originally had before, with the blur, it did it whenever you left the field. But now, with the submit, it only does it when you submit. So if we reload again, and then we come over here and type in, and I click out, now it's automatically updated and the validator ran. Of course, it'll output it again when I do it here as well as here. But you can see if you set it to submit for the update, you actually get a performance improvement because you're not constantly running all this code whenever you blur the box or type into it. Of course, if you want all of that to happen, then leave it set to blur. Don't change it to submit. But little things like this, especially for a very large form, can really go a long way in terms of improving the performance experience for the user who's actually utilizing the web page. So there's our last little demonstration, and hopefully you saw those 4 little practical things that have been added to Angular 5, which can be pretty useful. And of course, as we went through the list before, there's a lot of internal stuff that was done to actually improve things as well. And actually, through this process, we built a pretty good part of an Angular application. There's a lot more we could add to this, like actually adding stuff to the table and deleting and stuff like that. But in terms of demonstrating these features, here's the code. Now, all this code that you see here will be pushed up to GitHub immediately following the presentation. So coming back over to here, I'm going to, because I know we've gone probably a little bit long here, I'm going to grab the link, copy that. I'm going to put this in the chat window. I believe everybody here should be able to see the chat window. That will be the GitHub link where you can grab the code. You can't grab it yet. In fact, actually, we'll do it right now. We'll say git add git commit -m completed demo, if I could spell right. And then we'll say git push. Looks like I have a permission issue with my, this is my repository thing with my public or private key. I'll fix that and push the code up there as soon as this session is over. Okay, so with that said, let's go ahead and take some questions. If anybody has any questions and wants to put them in the question box, I'm more than happy to be able to answer them. Let's see here. How do we pass data between components? The way you're going to pass data between components is using the whole input-output mechanism. So basically, if you have a parent component and a child component, you can pass data from the parent component to the child by setting up an input on the child that will then be passed in through the attributes from the parent to the child. And then, of course, you can then pass data back up through the use of an output, which is done through the invocation of an event handler. So if you want to go learn more about that, you want to go check out the input and output decorators as part of the Angular API. And then you also want to learn something about the event emitter for outputting events using the outputs. Okay. Do we have any other questions from anybody else? We have the one question. Anybody have a question on anything? It can be on anything related to JavaScript. It can be related to Angular. Anything you'd like to ask a question about. All right, so while folks are thinking of some questions here, I'll offer, here we go. Okay. Okay, so the observable is the thing that is that you can observe. So for example, in our REST service request, we set up the observable so that when the REST service results came back, we could observe the results that came back. You can also do it like, for example, the WebSocket. You can be connected to a server via WebSockets, and whenever you get new data over the WebSocket, you can use an observable. Observables are really used for streaming data. I'm not necessarily a huge fan of using observables for REST service requests. I think promises kind of fit the problem a little bit better because promises are designed for single asynchronous results, whereas observables are designed for a stream. But within the Angular programming community, you typically see observables kind of used all over the place, not just even with REST service calls or WebSockets, but incorporating things like Redux with NGRX and things like that. The subscriber is just the thing that's observing the actual observable and subscribing to it and receiving the data that comes through it. All right. Data into a component, into other component, we have to pass the selector name. So you can inject the component object from a parent component into the child component. That is an Angular thing, and there are certain cases where that's useful. But in general, when we think about component-driven development, we really want to be thinking more about inputs and outputs, not necessarily injecting component objects from a parent into a child. Oh, the return can be anything. It can just be an object with a property, and then the property can be whatever you want it to be, and then it can just have a value assigned to it, and then you can reference that. All right. Do we have any other? To the person who's asking about the passing of the component. So I described to you the input-output way. Then there's the injector way, but you also have the ability to have like child content and stuff. And that's also another way. If you want to take a component that's bound to one set of data or one context and have it display inside of another component that's bound to a different context, you can also do that too. That has to do with the child content and view children and stuff like that. All right. Any other questions from anybody concerning Angular, JavaScript, the future, other frameworks or libraries? More than happy to answer here. Okay, to kind of wrap things up here, I highly recommend Angular 5. I highly recommend Angular in general. I have a lot of successful customers who use it. If you're trying to evaluate whether or not this framework is for you, you take a serious, hard look at it. It's great. TypeScript is a great language to work with. If you know JavaScript, adding a little bit of strong typing to it through TypeScript is really great in terms of a language. Even if you choose not to use Angular for enterprise projects, I love TypeScript. Nothing like having some really good, strong typing. And Visual Studio Code has a great implementation of TypeScript for providing the IntelliSense. Atom also has a really good plugin. And of course, you could use regular Visual Studio, but I love Visual Studio Code. Question about Ionic or Xamarin. I have not really worked a whole lot with either of those. I've done a little bit of stuff with both of them at different times throughout their history, but I would not really be in a position to comment at this moment to say the current version of each, which one is better than the other. So, certifications for Angular. That is a fantastic question. I think certifications for Angular would probably be impossible. As quickly as things change all the time, your certification would be out of date by the time you got it on the paper that it was printed on. Or I guess now they have the whole LinkedIn badges thing. I will tell you this, there is no official certification body. So whatever certificate or stuff that you get from a training just means you accomplished that training. I'm not aware of Google having any official certification body saying people who do X, Y, Z become certified. You have to be careful. There's a lot of training companies out there that really kind of push the you're going to become certified for things that don't really have certifications. A course completion certificate is absolutely appropriate. But to try to say, oh, we have this certification for Angular that's a recognized industry standard, that doesn't really exist. What you want to find when looking for Angular training is not somebody promising to offer you their version of a certification. You want to find people who know Angular and who have practical experience with it and can actually give you the knowledge you need, up-to-date knowledge on what is happening today with the framework, library, language, whatever it is, so that you can build great applications for your customers or within your business. Okay, and got a request here for the link again. So they're linked to the GitHub repo. after I fix my little public-private key issue thing, is right there. And you can check that out, and I'll get that pushed up relatively soon after class. Any other questions from anybody concerning anything about Angular or JavaScript? Okay, very cool. I want to thank everybody. Another question here. The migration checklist. Yes, let me put that in the chat window there. Here you go. I'll also put the slide deck up in the repository that has the links in it, so you can get access to the resources on the slide deck as well. Also, don't hesitate to email me. Here's my email again in the chat box. Always happy to answer questions for people who take our classes, attend our webinars. I'm always happy to see what I can do to help you out. Don't hesitate to write me. I always like hearing from people. Okay, so I think that's pretty much it. I want to thank all of you for taking the time to come out and be a part of this. And if there's anything else that myself or Accelebrate can do to be of benefit to you as you learn more about these technologies, please do not hesitate to reach out to us. We're always here to help and glad to do so. You guys take care and have a wonderful rest of your week.